For thousands of years, people told stories about a flood so immense that it seemed to erase entire worlds. Ancient cities vanished, coastlines disappeared beneath rising waters, and survivors carried memories of catastrophe across generations. But what if those legends were inspired by real events? What if a flood truly changed the course of human history forever? Tonight we journey back to a time when the world was transforming, when ice sheets melted, seas surged inland, and entire landscapes were lost beneath the waves. Along the way we'll uncover the evidence, the mysteries and the forgotten stories hidden beneath the water. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone fascinated by ancient mysteries and humanity's forgotten past. Now let's travel back to the flood that changed human history. The water arrives long before anyone understands what's happening. At first, it is only a distant change in the landscape. A shoreline that once seemed permanent creeps inland. A river begins reaching places it never reached before. Marshes expand into fields. Familiar paths vanish beneath shallow pools. A generation notices the difference and adapts. The next generation accepts it as normal. Then somewhere in the long span between memory and forgetting, a flood comes that is far larger than anything living people have ever seen. A village wakes to find the river no longer confined by its banks. A fishing camp built beside a lake discovers that the lake itself has become part of something larger. Coastal settlements watch the horizon transform as the sea advances across low ground. Forests die standing in salt water. Hunting territories disappear. Entire valleys become inlets. Land that once supported families for centuries simply ceases to exist. Thousands of years later, people still tell stories about it. The details change from place to place. The names are different. The heroes are different. The causes are different. Some stories speak of angry gods. Others describe divine judgment, cosmic disorder, or the cleansing of the world. Some focus on a chosen survivor. Others remember only destruction. Yet beneath these differences lies a remarkable pattern. Across continents separated by oceans and languages, human societies preserve memories of great floods. This similarity has fascinated scholars for centuries. Did ancient people simply create similar stories because floods are common experiences, or do some of these traditions preserve fragments of real events that occurred deep in the human past? Could memories survive for thousands of years, passed from generation to generation long before the invention of writing? Or are these stories symbolic creations that emerged independently in different cultures? The answers remain elusive. What makes the mystery so compelling is that the Earth itself tells a story of water on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Geological evidence reveals that the world experienced extraordinary environmental transformations after the end of the last ice age. Coastlines moved. Vast regions disappeared beneath rising seas. Rivers shifted course. Lakes expanded and burst through natural barriers. Entire landscapes vanished beneath water. For people living through such changes, the experience would not have felt like a slow, geological process. It would have felt like the end of the world. Modern maps create an illusion of permanence. Coastlines appear fixed. Seas seem stable. Continents look eternal. Yet the boundaries between land and water are surprisingly temporary. Over thousands of years, shorelines migrate. Oceans advance and retreat. Areas that seem safely inland can become submerged. Places now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water once supported forests, animals, and human communities. The world remembered in ancient flood traditions may not be a mythical world at all. Parts of it may have been real. Far beneath modern seas lie traces of landscapes that no longer exist. Divers have discovered drowned forests preserved beneath coastal waters. Sonar surveys reveal ancient river channels crossing sea floors. Archaeologists continue finding evidence that human populations once occupied regions now submerged. Every discovery adds another layer to an already fascinating puzzle. The lost worlds beneath the water are not legends. They are geological facts. The question is how these vanished landscapes became transformed into some of humanity's most enduring stories. Long before cities rose in Mesopotamia, before pyramids appeared along the Nile, before the first written records emerged, human beings lived close to rivers, lakes, and coastlines. Water provided fish transportation, fertile soil, and access to game. It was both a source of life and a source of danger. Communities naturally settled where water was abundant. Unfortunately, those same locations were often vulnerable to flooding. For prehistoric people, a major flood was not merely an inconvenience. It could destroy homes, erase food supplies, kill livestock, and force entire populations to relocate. Without modern forecasting systems, warnings were limited. A season of unusual rainfall or the sudden failure of a natural barrier could unleash catastrophe with little notice. What survives in the archaeological records suggests that ancient communities developed remarkable resilience. They rebuilt, they migrated, they adapted to changing environments. Yet adaptation does not erase memory. Stories become a form of survival. A dangerous river is remembered through narrative. A vanished shoreline is preserved through tradition. A disaster becomes a lesson passed to descendants. Over centuries, practical memories can evolve into cultural myths. Historical events may merge with symbolic meaning. Real floods can acquire supernatural explanations. The evidence remains incomplete, but the possibility is difficult to dismiss. Human beings are storytellers by nature. Long before writing, oral traditions carried knowledge across generations. These traditions preserved hunting routes, seasonal patterns, sacred locations, and collective experiences. In many societies, oral memory proved astonishingly durable. Important events could survive for centuries, sometimes even millennia, embedded within stories that evolved while retaining a recognizable core. This possibility has encouraged researchers to re-examine ancient flood traditions with fresh eyes. Rather than asking whether the stories are literally true, scholars increasingly ask a different question. What experiences inspired them? What environmental changes were significant enough to leave such deep impressions on human memory? Why do flood narratives appear with such persistence across different regions? No single explanation fully accounts for this pattern. Some traditions almost certainly emerged independently. Flooding is a common human experience. Communities living near rivers frequently face seasonal inundation. Similar environmental challenges can produce similar stories without requiring a shared origin. Yet other traditions seem unusually specific. They describe rising seas, drowned lands, displaced populations, and worlds transformed beyond recognition. These themes echo changes that scientists know occurred during the dramatic transition between the Ice Age and the modern world. The timing is intriguing. For most of human history, enormous ice sheets covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. Regions now submerged beneath oceans existed as dry land. Human populations occupied landscapes that modern people would scarcely recognize. Then the climate changed. The consequences unfolded over thousands of years, but in geological terms they happened with extraordinary speed. Ice melted, oceans expanded, shorelines retreated, entire ecosystems disappeared. Somewhere within that immense transformation lies the foundation of one of history's greatest mysteries. The flood stories may not point to a single catastrophe. They may instead preserve humanity's collective memory of a world that vanished beneath rising waters. A memory fragmented across cultures, reshaped by generations of retelling, yet rooted in real experiences witnessed by ancient people standing at the edge of profound environmental change. To understand how such memories might have formed it is necessary to travel back to a time before the floods, before the rising seas, and before the world took on its modern shape. The journey begins in a landscape that no longer exists. The lost world does not lie in some forgotten corner of the earth. It lies beneath the oceans. Today, when people look at a map, they see continents surrounded by water and often assume the outlines have remained largely unchanged throughout human history. The familiar shapes of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas appear timeless. Coastlines seem permanent, seas look fixed in place. Yet the world known to the first humans was dramatically different. 12,000 years ago, during the closing stages of the last ice age, vast quantities of the planet's water remained trapped inside enormous glaciers and continental ice sheets. Because so much water was locked away as ice, global sea levels stood far lower than they do today. The difference was not a few feet or even a few dozen feet. In many regions, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than modern levels. The consequences were extraordinary. Entire landscapes that now hidden beneath ocean water once existed as open plains, rolling hills, forests, marshlands, and river valleys. People hunted there. Animals migrated across them. Families established camps and returned to familiar locations year after year. These places were as real to their inhabitants as any modern nation is today. One of the largest lost regions connected what is now Britain to continental Europe. Modern travellers think of Britain as an island separated from the mainland by the English Channel and the North Sea. During much of the Ice Age, however, that separation did not exist. Between Britain and Europe stretched a vast lowland landscape that archaeologists call Doggerland. Far from being a barren wasteland, Doggerland appears to have been rich in resources. Rivers crossed its plains, wetlands attracted wildlife, forests provided shelter and fuel. Herds of deer, wild cattle, and other animals moved through the region. For prehistoric hunter-gatherers, it may have been one of the most attractive environments in northern Europe. Today it rests beneath the North Sea. Fishing boats occasionally pull ancient bones from the seabed. Fossils of mammoths' tools fashioned by humans and fragments of long-vanished ecosystems emerge from underwater sediments. Every discovery offers a glimpse of a landscape erased by rising seas. Doggerland is only one example. Across Southeast Asia, another immense region once linked islands and mainland territories that are now separated by ocean. During periods of lower sea level, much of what is currently submerged beneath the Java Sea, the South China Sea and surrounding waters formed a vast connected landmass known as Sunderland. Rivers flowed across enormous plains that no longer exist. Tropical forests stretched across areas now occupied by shallow seas. Human populations moved through environments that have completely disappeared from modern maps. The Persian Gulf provides another striking example. Today it is a body of water bordered by some of the most arid landscapes on Earth. Yet during periods of lower sea level, much of the Gulf basin was dry land. Some researchers suggest that rivers flowing through this region may have created an exceptionally fertile environment that attracted prehistoric populations. Scholars still debate the extent of human occupation there, but the possibility remains intriguing. Entire chapters of early human history may be hidden beneath waters that later filled the basin. Similar stories appear around the globe. The coastlines of China extended farther outward. Australia's shape differed substantially from its modern form. Vast shelves surrounding the Americas stood exposed. Places that now lie beneath waves once supported ecosystems and human communities. To the people who lived there, these landscapes were not temporary. They were home. No one standing beside a river in Doggerland could have imagined that future generations would sail ships hundreds of feet above that same location. No family camping along the edges of Sunderland could have known that their descendants would one day see those lands represented only as underwater contours on scientific maps. The transformation happened slowly enough that a single human lifetime might not witness the full scale of change. Yet slow does not mean insignificant. A coastline retreating a few feet each year may seem minor. Over decades, however, entire stretches of land vanish. A village relocated once may survive. A village forced to relocate repeatedly over generations experiences something much more profound. The landscape itself becomes unstable. For people living close to the sea, subtle environmental changes would have accumulated year after year. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Shorelines moved. Saltwater intruded into freshwater systems. Animal migration patterns shifted. Fishing grounds changed. Resources that once seemed dependable became uncertain. Adaptation became a necessity. Human beings proved remarkably capable of responding to these challenges. Archaeological evidence from numerous regions suggests that prehistoric populations adjusted their hunting strategies, modified settlement patterns, and explored new territories as environmental conditions evolved. Yet adaptation came at a cost. Every migration meant leaving behind places tied to memory and identity. Every flooded valley represented more than lost territory. It represented lost knowledge, lost traditions, and lost connections to ancestral landscapes. Modern people often think of migration as movement between locations on a stable map. For many prehistoric communities, the map itself was changing. The world beneath their feet was literally disappearing. This process likely unfolded unevenly. Some areas experienced gradual flooding over centuries. Others may have undergone sudden transformations when natural barriers failed, or powerful storms struck vulnerable coastlines. Geological records reveal that rising seas rarely advance in a perfectly smooth manner. Periods of relative stability can be interrupted by episodes of accelerated change. Such moments would have been especially memorable. A slowly advancing shoreline might become accepted as part of life. A sudden inundation capable of destroying settlements would be remembered differently. It would become a story told around fires, repeated to children, and carried into future generations. The evidence suggests that many prehistoric populations occupied coastal zones, because those environments offered exceptional opportunities. Rivers met the sea there, fish were abundant, transportation was easier. Resources from multiple ecosystems could be accessed within relatively small areas. Ironically, the most attractive places to live were often the most vulnerable. As sea levels continued to rise after the Ice Age, countless coastal settlements disappeared. Most left little trace. Wood decayed, structures collapsed, sediments accumulated, water concealed the evidence. Archaeologists face a frustrating challenge because many of humanity's earliest coastal sites are now underwater. The record that survives on land may represent only part of the story. Some of the most important evidence remains hidden beneath seas, bays, and continental shelves. This realization has transformed how researchers think about prehistory. For generations, ancient coastlines received relatively little attention because they were difficult to investigate. Advances in underwater archaeology, marine geology, and remote sensing technology are gradually revealing these lost worlds. The discoveries are remarkable. Ancient river systems appear where no rivers exist today. Forests emerge from beneath tidal waters. Human artifacts are recovered from submerged landscapes. Each find reinforces the same conclusion. The Earth known to prehistoric people differed profoundly from the Earth known today, and as the waters slowly advanced across these vanished lands, humanity found itself living through one of the greatest environmental transformations in its entire history. The source of that transformation lay far to the north, where immense walls of ice still dominated much of the planet. Far beyond the horizons of the lost coastal plains, beyond the forests of Doggerland and the drowned river valleys of Sonderland, A frozen giant dominates the planet. For thousands of years, enormous ice sheets cover vast portions of the northern hemisphere. They spread across much of North America. They blanket Scandinavia. They extend across northern Europe. In some places, the ice reaches thicknesses measured not in feet, but in kilometers. Entire mountain ranges disappear beneath frozen weight. Valleys vanish. Rivers cease to exist. From a modern perspective, the scale is difficult to comprehend. The largest cities on Earth could fit beneath these glaciers many times over. Landscapes that now support hundreds of millions of people lie buried under immense expanses of ice. What appears permanent in the modern world is during the Ice Age entirely transformed. The planet itself operates differently. Winds follow altered paths. Ocean currents behave differently. Rainfall patterns shift. Vast regions become colder and drier. Ecosystems adjust to conditions that would seem alien to modern societies. Yet even during the height of this frozen age, human beings survive. They adapt to severe climates. They follow migrating animals. They learn to exploit resources in difficult environments. Across Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, human communities continue expanding into new territories despite extraordinary environmental challenges. The Ice Age is not a single moment but a long and complex chapter in Earth's history. Temperatures fluctuate. Glaciers advance and retreat. Some periods become colder. Others grow somewhat warmer. The frozen world is constantly changing, though often on timescales too slow for individuals to perceive. Then something begins to shift. Roughly 20,000 years ago, the immense ice sheets that have dominated the planet for millennia begin a long retreat. The exact causes involve subtle changes in Earth's orbit, variations in solar energy, reaching the planet feedback mechanisms within the climate system, and interactions between oceans, atmosphere, and ice. The science behind these processes is complex. The result is simple. The world starts warming. At first, the changes appear modest. Seasonal patterns alter. Glaciers lose ground at their margins. Snow cover decreases in some regions. Plants gradually expand into areas previously too cold to support them. But the warming does not stop. Year after year, century after century, the ice continues shrinking. The retreat of these glaciers represents one of the greatest transfers of water in human history. For countless generations, enormous volumes of fresh water remain locked inside frozen reservoirs. As temperatures rise, that water begins returning to rivers, lakes, and oceans. The consequences extend far beyond the glaciers themselves. A melting ice sheet is not merely a regional phenomenon. It influences sea levels across the entire planet. Water released in North America affects coastlines in Asia. Ice melting in Scandinavia ultimately contributes to changes along distant shores thousands of miles away. Everything is connected. The Earth begins entering a period of environmental transition unlike anything modern civilization has experienced. In places near the ice sheets, the effects are dramatic. Glaciers carve landscapes as they retreat. Vast quantities of sediment are transported by meltwater. New lakes form in depressions left behind by the ice. Rivers establish new courses. Ecosystems rapidly reorganize themselves. Animals respond first. Species adapted to cold conditions gradually shift their ranges. Some move northward, following preferred climates. Others decline as their habitats shrink. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and numerous other Ice Age animals face increasing pressures from changing environments. Human populations respond as well. Groups that once occupied limited territories begin exploring newly accessible regions. Areas previously covered by ice become available for settlement. Fresh resources emerge. New migration routes open. Opportunity and uncertainty arrive together. For communities living near the retreating ice, the landscape changes within living memory. Rivers appear where none existed before, lakes expand, vegetation spreads across formerly barren terrain. Entire ecosystems develop over surprisingly short periods. The world becomes more dynamic. Modern observers often imagine prehistoric people existing in static environments. The reality appears very different. Many generations live through continual environmental transformation. Adaptation becomes a normal part of life. Still, the greatest consequences remain largely invisible. Most people living at the time cannot see the global picture. They witness local changes but have no way of understanding that coastlines thousands of miles away are also shifting. They do not know that entire lowland regions are gradually approaching their end. The melting ice is reshaping the planet one shoreline at a time. Scientists estimate that global sea levels rise by more than 100 meters between the peak of the last ice age and the establishment of modern coastlines. The increase does not occur evenly. Some periods progress relatively slowly, others accelerate dramatically. These episodes of accelerated rise are especially important. Evidence preserved in coral reefs, marine sediments, and geological formations suggests that at certain times enormous quantities of meltwater enter the oceans over comparatively short periods. Researchers refer to some of these episodes as meltwater pulses. The name sounds technical. The reality is extraordinary. Imagine coastlines retreating not over countless millennia, but within spans meaningful to human communities. Imagine low-lying regions experiencing repeated flooding as sea levels climb faster than previous generations have known. For people living in vulnerable coastal zones, such changes would have profound consequences. The exact rates remain subjects of scientific investigation. Scholars continue debating details regarding timing, regional variation, and the mechanisms responsible for particular events. The evidence remains incomplete in some areas. What is clear is that sea levels do not rise smoothly and quietly throughout the entire transition. Moments of rapid change occur. Those moments matter. A family living beside a slowly advancing shoreline may adapt through relocation. A community confronted by repeated flooding over a few generations experiences something more disruptive. Land once considered secure becomes uncertain. Places associated with ancestors become inaccessible. Memories form. Stories begin. The psychological impact may be as important as the physical transformation. Humans naturally seek explanations for dramatic events. They create narratives to preserve lessons and communicate danger. Environmental upheaval becomes embedded within collective memory. Long after the original circumstances fade, the stories remain. Meanwhile, in regions close to the retreating ice sheets, another phenomenon develops that will play a crucial role in humanity's flood history. As glaciers melt, they sometimes leave behind immense lakes trapped by natural barriers of ice and sediment. Some of these lakes contain astonishing quantities of water. They are temporary features, and temporary features can fail. Behind fragile natural dams, vast reservoirs accumulate. They appear stable. They may remain stable for centuries. Yet the forces holding them in place are often weaker than they seem. When those barriers eventually break, the results can be catastrophic. Entire landscapes may be transformed in days. Rivers can swell beyond imagination. Valleys can be scoured clean. Floodwaters can travel enormous distances carrying sediment, ice, and debris. The warming world is creating conditions for some of the largest floods ever witnessed by human beings. The waters that will reshape coastlines are already moving. The waters that will carve valleys and overwhelm landscapes are already gathering. And somewhere near the margins of the melting ice, the first great surges are beginning to form. The melting of the great ice sheets is not a gentle process. From a distance, it might appear slow and orderly. Temperatures rise, glaciers shrink, water flows toward the sea. Yet hidden within this vast transformation are moments of extraordinary violence, episodes when the landscape changes not over centuries, but in a matter of days. As the ice retreats, it leaves behind enormous lakes trapped against the remaining glaciers. Some are larger than modern countries. Their waters accumulate year after year, fed by constant melting. From above they appear calm. Their surfaces reflect the sky. Their shoreline seems stable. But stability can be deceptive. Many of these lakes are held in place by barriers made of ice, loose sediment, or natural ridges formed during the retreat of the glaciers. These barriers are often temporary. They were never designed to last forever. Pressure builds. Water finds weaknesses. Eventually, in some cases, the barrier fails. When it does, the results are almost unimaginable. One of the most famous examples is a vast body of water known as Lake Agassiz. During the closing stages of the Ice Age, this immense lake occupies huge portions of what is now central North America. At times, it becomes one of the largest freshwater lakes ever known to exist on Earth. Its size dwarfs many modern lakes. Standing on its shores would feel less like looking at a lake and more like looking at an inland sea. The horizon stretches into the distance. Storms move across its surface. Waves crash against shorelines. Yet Lake Agassiz is not permanent. As the ice sheets continue retreating, drainage routes change. Natural dams weaken. Water seeks new paths toward the oceans. Over thousands of years, portions of the lake escape through different outlets. Some releases occur gradually, others appear far more dramatic. Scientists continue investigating the exact timing and magnitude of these events, but evidence suggests that enormous volumes of fresh water periodically surge from glacial lakes into surrounding river systems and eventually into the oceans. The consequences extend far beyond the immediate flood zones. Fresh water entering the oceans can influence currents. Ocean circulation patterns may shift. Climate systems can respond in unexpected ways. A flood in one region can contribute to environmental changes thousands of miles away. This interconnectedness is one of the most remarkable aspects of Earth's climate system. Nothing happens in isolation. The release of glacial lakes also leaves physical scars across the landscape. In parts of North America, geologists have identified enormous channels carved by ancient floodwaters. Some valleys appear too large for the rivers that currently occupy them. Massive gravel deposits sit in locations where ordinary river processes cannot easily explain them. The evidence points toward extraordinary floods. Not floods measured in seasonal terms. Floods measured on geological scales. One of the most striking examples comes from the Pacific Northwest of North America, where researchers have reconstructed a series of catastrophic events associated with an ancient glacial lake known as Lake Missoula. For years, the idea seemed almost unbelievable. The landscape contains enormous dry channels, giant ripple-like formations etched into the ground, and other features that appear far too large to have been created by normal rivers. Early explanations struggled to account for them. Eventually, a different picture emerged. A massive lake had repeatedly formed behind an ice dam. When the dam failed, unimaginable quantities of water raced across the region. Entire valleys were inundated. Rock was stripped away. Sediment was transported over vast distances. The floodwaters moved with astonishing force. What today appears as quiet countryside once experienced torrents capable of reshaping the land itself. These events occurred long before written history. No eyewitness accounts survive. Yet the landscape preserves the memory. Stone remembers what people forget. The floods leave marks so immense that they remain visible thousands of years later. Such events reveal an important truth about the world emerging from the Ice Age. Environmental change is not always gradual. Sometimes long periods of apparent stability are interrupted by sudden transformations. This pattern may have had profound implications for human communities. Most prehistoric people do not live near the largest glacial lakes. Yet they occupy river valleys, coastal plains, and lowland regions that can still be affected by changing water systems. Rivers respond to increased meltwater, lakes expand, wetlands spread, flood frequencies shift. The effects ripple outward. A village need not sit directly beside a collapsing ice dam to experience consequences. Changes occurring hundreds of miles away can alter local environments. Water connects landscapes that appear separate. For generations, people living during this period witness a world in motion. The rivers their grandparents knew behave differently. Shorelines migrate. Seasonal patterns become less predictable. Familiar landmarks disappear beneath water or sediment. Adaptation remains possible. Many communities thrive despite these challenges. Human beings prove remarkably flexible. They alter migration routes, develop new strategies for gathering food, and establish settlements in changing environments. Yet flexibility has limits. There are moments when nature moves faster than society can respond. A flood destroys a settlement. A river abandons its channel. A fertile valley becomes a marsh. A coastline retreats beyond recognition. Such experiences do not merely alter geography, they alter memory. The emotional impact of environmental catastrophe is often underestimated. Modern disasters provide some insight. Even when people survive the loss of home landscape, and familiarity leaves lasting impressions, memories are shared within families. Stories become warnings. Significant events become reference points in collective identity. The same process likely occurs in prehistory. A child who survives a devastating flood grows into an elder who recounts the experience. Details shift over time, explanations evolve. Yet the central event remains important because it carries meaning. The flood becomes more than weather. It becomes history. In societies without written records, history lives inside stories. This realization has led some researchers to reconsider ancient traditions once dismissed as purely mythical. Oral cultures are capable of preserving information for surprisingly long periods. While details change, certain core elements can persist across generations. Scholars still debate how accurately specific events can survive within oral traditions. The evidence varies from culture to culture. No single explanation fully accounts for every case. Even so, the possibility remains compelling. Some flood narratives may preserve echoes of genuine environmental experiences. Not exact historical reports, but cultural memories shaped by centuries of retelling. If that is true, then the search for humanity's flood stories is not simply a search for myth. It is a search for memory. And memory becomes increasingly important as the oceans continue rising. The great glacial floods carve valleys and reshape continents. But another process is quietly unfolding along coastlines around the world. Sea levels keep climbing. Year after year, generation after generation, the boundary between land and ocean moves inland. Entire regions begin approaching a fate from which there is no recovery. Unlike a river flood which eventually retreats, the sea does not give the land back. Once the water arrives, it stays. And for countless communities living on the low coastal plains of the post-Ice Age world, the greatest losses are still ahead. The sea does not arrive all at once. It advances with a patience that no human society can match. A single year reveals little. A shoreline shifts by a few steps. A familiar beach narrows slightly. Saltwater reaches farther upstream during storms. Most people adapt without difficulty. Life continues. Fishing grounds remain productive. Rivers still provide fresh water. Children grow up knowing the landscape as it exists in their own time. Then decades pass. The changes become harder to ignore. A hunting area disappears beneath tidal waters. A grove of trees begins dying as salt infiltrates the soil. A campsite used for generations becomes unusable. A path that once connected neighboring communities vanishes beneath a shallow bay. The process repeats, again and again. For the people experiencing it, the transformation is not measured in geological timescales. It is measured in family histories. Grandparents remember places that younger generations have never seen. Stories emerge about lands that once existed beyond the water. Those stories are not legends yet. They are memories. Across the world, countless coastal regions experience this slow retreat of the land. Some changes occur gradually enough to allow adaptation. Others unfold more dramatically when storms, unusually high tides, or regional flooding events accelerate the process. The cumulative effect is enormous. Scientists estimate that hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of habitable land disappear beneath rising seas after the Ice Age. Entire landscapes vanish. River valleys become estuaries. Low plains become continental shelves hidden beneath shallow oceans. Few places illustrate this transformation more clearly than Doggerland. For thousands of years, this vast region connects Britain to mainland Europe. It contains rivers, lakes, wetlands, forests, and rich ecosystems capable of supporting substantial human populations. Archaeological evidence recovered from the North Sea suggests that people live there, hunt there, and move across its terrain long before it disappears. The end does not come in a single catastrophe, at least not at first. Rising seas steadily reduce the available land. Wetlands expand, coastlines retreat, habitable areas shrink, communities likely relocate multiple times as conditions evolve. Yet the story may contain a dramatic final chapter. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive underwater landslide occurs off the coast of Norway. Known today as the Storegga Slide, it ranks among the largest known submarine landslides in Earth's history. Millions of tons of sediment collapse. The displacement generates powerful tsunami waves that spread across parts of the North Atlantic. Evidence suggests these waves strike coastlines in Scotland and surrounding regions. Researchers continue debating exactly how severely Doggerland is affected, but many believe the tsunami contributes to the final destruction of some remaining low-lying areas. The timing is striking. A landscape already weakened by rising seas suddenly faces an extraordinary event. If people witnessed the tsunami, the experience would have been terrifying. A sea that normally follows predictable rhythms suddenly behaves like a living force. Water rushes inland. Settlements are overwhelmed. Familiar terrain disappears beneath violent waves. No written records survive, yet it's easy to imagine how such an event might persist in memory. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue debating the scale of the impact. No single explanation fully accounts for the final disappearance of Doggerland. Rising seas alone are sufficient to explain much of its loss. Still, the possibility of a devastating tsunami adds another layer to the story. A slow drowning of the land may have ended with a sudden blow. Similar processes unfold elsewhere. Across Southeast Asia, the shrinking of Sunderland transforms geography on a continental scale. Areas that once formed a connected landmass gradually become separated by expanding seas. Populations that previously moved across continuous terrain find themselves divided by water. The consequences extend beyond geography. Isolation encourages cultural divergence. Migration routes change. Trade networks evolve. Human groups that once shared direct contact become separated by emerging straits and channels. The sea reshapes human history without intention. It creates barriers. It creates opportunities. It creates entirely new worlds. Modern coastlines often conceal this history. Looking at the islands of Indonesia today, it is difficult to imagine that many were once linked by broad plains. Yet geological evidence leaves little doubt. The map familiar to modern observers is relatively recent. For prehistoric populations, the transformation must have felt profound. Each generation inherits a landscape slightly different from the one known by its ancestors. This gradual loss of land creates an unusual relationship with memory. Unlike a sudden disaster that kills many people at once, rising seas produce a slower kind of grief. Places remain visible long enough to be remembered. Communities relocate while retaining knowledge of what has been lost. The drowned world remains present in stories. A bay was once a valley. An island was once a hill. The sea now covers what was once home. Such memories can become surprisingly resilient. Modern research into oral traditions suggests that some societies preserve accounts of environmental changes for remarkable lengths of time. In Australia, for example, certain indigenous traditions appear to contain descriptions of coastlines and sea level changes that may reflect events thousands of years old. Researchers approach such claims carefully. Oral traditions are complex. They evolve over time. Establishing precise historical connections is challenging. Nevertheless, the possibility is significant. Human memory may reach further into the past than many scholars once assumed. If communities can preserve recollections of changing coastlines across millennia, then the flood traditions found around the world become even more intriguing. Perhaps they are not merely symbolic tales. Perhaps some contain fragments of lived experience, not exact accounts, not historical documents, but echoes. Echoes of real places, real losses, and real transformations. The people who witness these changes do not know they are living through one of the most important environmental transitions in human history. They are simply responding to immediate challenges. They move settlements. They adapt to new shorelines. They search for resources. They teach their children where danger lies. Yet every adaptation generates new memories, and memories accumulate. By the time sea levels approach something close to their modern position, countless generations have experienced some form of environmental disruption. Entire regions have disappeared. New seas have formed. Old migration routes have vanished. The world itself has been rewritten. Some of the lost landscapes remain hidden beneath shallow waters, where fishermen occasionally recover ancient artifacts. Others lie deeper beneath the sea, waiting for technologies capable of revealing them. They are reminders of a simple truth. The modern coastline is not permanent. It is merely the latest version, and for the people who lived through its creation, the advance of the sea may have seemed less like a natural process, and more like a force beyond human control, a force capable of swallowing worlds. The memory of such a force would not disappear easily. It would travel with survivors. It would pass from parent to child. It would become part of humanity's shared inheritance. And over time, memory would begin its long transformation into story. The first stories are probably simple. A dangerous river is remembered because it once destroyed a settlement. A coastline is described because it used to exist farther from the sea. An unusual hill becomes important because it served as refuge during a flood. The purpose of such stories is practical. They help communities survive. They preserve knowledge. They warn future generations about places where nature has proven unpredictable. Over time, however, stories rarely remain unchanged. Every retelling introduces subtle differences. Details are forgotten, new details are added. Historical events become linked with cultural values. Lessons become more important than precise facts. The memory of a flood gradually evolves into something larger than the flood itself. This process is not unique to ancient societies. Modern people do the same thing. Major disasters often become simplified narratives passed between generations. Certain details are emphasized, others disappear. Human memory naturally organizes events into meaningful patterns. The difference is that prehistoric communities rely almost entirely on oral transmission. Without written records, stories become the archive. They preserve geography. They preserve identity. They preserve memory. Across the world, many indigenous cultures demonstrate remarkable abilities to maintain oral traditions over long periods. These traditions are not random collections of myths. They often contain information about landscapes, resources, migration routes, and environmental hazards. In Australia, researchers have become particularly interested in traditions that appear to describe coastal environments very different from those visible today. Some stories speak of lands now submerged beneath the sea. Others describe islands that were once connected to the mainland. Certain narratives contain geographical details that correspond surprisingly well with reconstructions of ancient coastlines. Scholars still debate how these connections should be interpreted. The evidence remains incomplete. Oral traditions are living cultural systems rather than historical documents. They change over time. Multiple influences shape their development. It is difficult to determine exactly how old any particular element may be. Yet the possibility is difficult to ignore. If even a portion of these traditions preserve memories of rising seas, they would represent some of the oldest surviving human recollections on Earth. The implications are extraordinary. It would mean that echoes of environmental events from thousands of years ago remain present in stories told today. Similar possibilities emerge elsewhere. Along various coastlines around the world, traditional narratives describe vanished lands, flooded valleys, and changing shorelines. Some accounts may be symbolic. Some may reflect later historical events. Others may preserve fragments of much older experiences. No single explanation fully accounts for all of them. What survives in the record suggests a complex mixture of memory symbolism and cultural adaptation. This complexity becomes even more fascinating when viewed against the backdrop of post-Ice Age environmental change. The people living through rising sea levels are not experiencing one isolated disaster. They are witnessing generations of transformation. A flood destroys a settlement. A storm accelerates coastal erosion. A river changes course. A fertile plain becomes a shallow bay. Each event contributes another layer to collective memory. Some memories fade, others endure. The ones that endure are often those connected to powerful emotions. Fear is memorable. Loss is memorable. Survival is memorable. A community forced to abandon its homeland is unlikely to forget the experience quickly. Even centuries later, descendants may continue referring to ancestral territories now inaccessible beneath water. The exact details may blur, but the central reality remains. Something important was lost. Modern archaeology increasingly reveals just how much may have disappeared. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists focused primarily on sites located on land. The approach was understandable. Excavating underwater is difficult, expensive, and technologically challenging. Yet this focus created an unintended blind spot. Many of humanity's most attractive prehistoric environments were coastal, and many prehistoric coastlines now lie underwater. As researchers began investigating submerged landscapes, a troubling realization emerged. Entire chapters of human history may be hidden beneath the sea. Some of the earliest coastal settlements could have vanished without leaving visible traces on modern land. Communities that once occupied river mouths, estuaries, and fertile coastal plains may now rest beneath layers of sediment and seawater. The archaeological record is incomplete not because those people never existed, but because their world disappeared. This realization gives new weight to ancient flood traditions. For generations, many scholars treated flood narratives primarily as literary or religious phenomena. The stories were important culturally but not necessarily connected to real events. That perspective has gradually evolved. Few researchers now argue that every flood tradition reflects a single historical catastrophe. The evidence simply does not support such a straightforward conclusion. However, many scholars acknowledge that real environmental experiences almost certainly influenced at least some of these narratives. The challenge lies in determining which experiences. A local river flood can inspire a story. A tsunami can inspire a story. A disappearing coastline can inspire a story. A dramatic sea level rise can inspire a story. The same narrative themes may emerge from multiple causes. This is one reason the mystery remains unsolved. Flood traditions are widespread because floods themselves are widespread. Human beings have always lived near water, and water has always possessed the power to reshape lives. As populations grow during the post-Ice Age, world communities increasingly establish themselves near rivers and fertile floodplains. These environments offer abundant resources. They support agriculture, they encourage trade. Yet they also expose people to recurring danger. The relationship becomes paradoxical. The most desirable places to live are often the most vulnerable. This pattern will eventually help produce some of history's most famous civilizations. It will also help produce some of history's most famous flood stories. The foundations are already being laid. Along river valleys and emerging agricultural centers, memories of environmental upheaval continue accumulating. Stories circulate between generations. Experiences become traditions. As centuries pass, those traditions grow more elaborate. Historical memory intertwines with spirituality. Practical warnings merge with moral lessons. Natural disasters acquire supernatural explanations. The flood is no longer merely a flood. It becomes a symbol of destruction, a symbol of renewal, a symbol of humanity's fragile relationship with the forces of nature. Somewhere in this process, the memory of real events begins transforming into the great flood narratives that will later appear in written records. Those written records are still far in the future. Cities have not yet risen. Empires do not yet exist. But when writing finally emerges, many civilizations will already possess ancient stories about waters that once overwhelmed the world. And among all those traditions, none will become more influential than the flood stories born in the fertile lands between two great rivers. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, water is both creator and destroyer. The rivers descend from distant mountains and cross broad plains before eventually reaching the sea. Along their banks, fertile soils accumulate year after year. Crops flourish, settlements expand, trade becomes possible. The region supports one of humanity's earliest and most influential centers of civilization. Yet prosperity comes with risk. The same rivers that nourish life can become dangerously unpredictable. Seasonal floods sweep across low-lying terrain. Channels shift. Levees fail. Fields disappear beneath muddy water. Entire communities may find themselves struggling against forces they cannot control. For the people who inhabit ancient Mesopotamia, flooding is not an occasional curiosity. It is a defining reality. This reality helps shape some of the most famous flood traditions ever recorded. Thousands of years after the post-Ice Age seas begin reshaping coastlines around the world, the first cities emerge in Mesopotamia. Writing develops. Administrators keep records. Priests preserve traditions. Stories that once existed only in oral form can finally be written down. When that happens, flood narratives enter history. Among the most important is a story preserved in various Mesopotamian texts, including versions associated with the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians. Although details differ across centuries and cultures, the central theme remains familiar. A devastating flood destroys much of humanity. A chosen survivor receives warning. A vessel is constructed. Life is preserved. The waters eventually recede. The world begins again. Modern readers often recognize similarities between these traditions and later flood narratives that appear in other religious texts. Those similarities are real and historically significant. Scholars generally agree that cultural influences connect several of these traditions across time. What remains less certain is the original source of the story. Did it emerge from one specific disaster? Did it preserve memories of multiple floods? Was it primarily symbolic? Or did it combine historical experiences with religious meaning? No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Archaeology provides intriguing clues. During the 20th century, excavations at several ancient Mesopotamian sites uncovered layers of flood deposits buried beneath human settlements. In some locations, archaeologists discovered thick bands of silt separating different periods of occupation. At first, some researchers believed they had found evidence for a single catastrophic flood responsible for the famous traditions. The reality proved more complicated. Different sites reveal flood deposits from different periods. The floods are not all simultaneous. Some settlements experience major inundations while others nearby show little evidence of disruption. This pattern suggests that no single flood affected the entire region at once. Instead, Mesopotamia appears to have experienced repeated flooding over long spans of time. From a geological perspective, this is unsurprising. Large river systems naturally flood. Exceptional events occasionally exceed normal expectations. A flood devastating enough to destroy one city might leave another relatively unharmed. Yet from a human perspective, such distinctions matter less. For the people living through the disaster, the flood that destroys their world is effectively global. A farmer whose fields vanish beneath water does not need the entire planet to be submerged in order to experience catastrophe. A city cut off by flood waters may feel as though civilization itself is collapsing. This observation is important. Many ancient flood traditions may describe events that are local in geographical scale but immense in human significance. The distinction between local and universal is not always obvious within traditional narratives. Stories often expand in scope as they are retold. A regional disaster becomes a world-shaping event. Human memory naturally gravitates towards significance rather than precision. The Mesopotamian flood stories likely develop within this environment. The rivers create extraordinary fertility. The rivers also create extraordinary danger. Generations witness destructive floods. Communities rebuild, memories accumulate, religious interpretations emerge. Eventually, those memories become literature. One of the most famous appearances occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history. Within the epic appears a flood narrative featuring a survivor who preserves life through a great deluge. The story contains elements that later become familiar across multiple traditions. A warning, a vessel, animals, floodwaters, renewal. Scholars have studied these parallels for centuries. What makes them particularly fascinating is not simply their literary influence, but their possible connection to deeper environmental memories. Mesopotamia itself occupies a landscape shaped by water. The lower portions of the region are flat and vulnerable to flooding. Rivers transport enormous quantities of sediment. Channels migrate over time. Wetlands expand and contract. Human societies continuously adapt to changing conditions. The environment encourages both prosperity and anxiety. Water gives life. Water takes life away. This duality becomes deeply embedded within cultural thought. The flood is not merely destruction, it is also transformation. Fields devastated by inundation may later become fertile. River sediments can renew agricultural productivity even after disaster. Creation and destruction become inseparable. This theme appears repeatedly throughout human flood traditions. The waters erase. The waters renew. The old world disappears. A new world emerges. Such patterns resonate because they reflect real experiences observed by generations living beside powerful rivers. Yet Mesopotamia is not unique. As researchers compare flood traditions from different regions, they discover both similarities and important differences. Some narratives emphasize survival. Others focus on divine punishment. Some describe boats. Others describe mountains, caves, or elevated refuges. The diversity suggests that no single event lies behind every story. Instead, multiple traditions likely develop from multiple experiences. Floods occur in different environments for different reasons. River floods, coastal inundations, tsunamis, storm surges, glacial lake outbursts. Each leaves its own mark on human memory. Mesopotamia simply provides one of the earliest opportunities to observe how those memories become written history. The written record transforms everything. Stories that might otherwise have vanished survive across millennia. They can be copied, translated, adapted, and transmitted far beyond their original cultural context. As civilizations rise and fall, the flood narrative continues traveling. It crosses languages. It crosses religions. It crosses empires. Eventually, variations of the story become known across vast portions of the world. Yet beyond the great literary traditions of Mesopotamia lies a broader mystery. Flood stories are not confined to one civilization. They appear in regions with no direct connection to the ancient cities between the Tigris and Euphrates. Some emerge in distant continents, others develop on isolated islands. The pattern is so widespread that it raises a remarkable possibility. Perhaps humanity's memory of water runs deeper than any single culture. Perhaps the stories survive because countless communities and countless places experience their own versions of the same ancient fear. The fear of watching the world disappear beneath rising water. The farther researchers look, the more flood stories they find. They appear in deserts and rainforests, on islands and mountain ranges, among farming societies and hunter-gatherer communities. They emerge in civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years of independent development. The details vary enormously, yet the recurring presence of water destruction, survival and renewal remains striking. For centuries, this pattern encouraged speculation. Some believed the stories proved that a single worldwide flood had occurred in the distant past. Others argued that the similarities were entirely coincidental. Still others suggested that one original narrative spread outward and influenced many cultures. Modern scholarship tends to favor more complex explanations. The evidence suggests that multiple factors are involved. Some traditions may reflect local disasters. Some may preserve memories of ancient environmental changes. Others may have been influenced by cultural exchange between neighboring societies. No single explanation fully accounts for every flood story found around the world. Yet the sheer number of these traditions remains remarkable. In ancient Greece, stories survive describing great floods associated with the destruction of earlier ages. One of the most famous involves Deucalion and Pyrrha survivors of a devastating deluge that wipes away much of humanity. The tale contains familiar elements of destruction and renewal, though it develops within a distinctly Greek cultural framework. Elsewhere around the Mediterranean, different communities preserve their own memories of catastrophic waters. In South Asia, flood traditions appear in several forms. Some narratives describe a great flood from which humanity survives through divine warning and preparation. Over centuries, these stories become woven into broader religious and philosophical traditions. In East Asia, flood narratives often focus not only on destruction, but also on the challenge of controlling water. Rather than emphasizing total annihilation, some traditions celebrate figures who successfully manage floods through engineering, perseverance, and organization. This distinction is revealing. Different societies remember water according to their own environmental realities. For communities regularly threatened by rivers, flood control becomes a central concern. For coastal populations, the sea may play a larger role. For island societies, storms and tsunamis may leave deeper impressions. The stories reflect the landscapes from which they emerge. Yet they also reveal shared human experiences. People everywhere confront uncertainty. People everywhere experience loss. People everywhere attempt to understand forces beyond their control. Flood narratives provide a framework for doing so. Across the Pacific Ocean, indigenous traditions from numerous island cultures describe dramatic changes in sea levels, destructive waves, or ancestral lands affected by water. Some accounts may reflect historical tsunamis. Others may preserve memories of coastal transformation stretching back many generations. Researchers approach such traditions carefully. The goal is not to treat every story as a literal historical document. Oral traditions contain symbolic meanings, spiritual dimensions, and cultural purposes that extend beyond simple record keeping. At the same time, dismissing them entirely would be a mistake. Many traditions contain detailed environmental knowledge accumulated over centuries. They preserve observations about landscapes, hazards, and ecological change. In some cases, modern science has confirmed geographical details, embedded within stories long considered mythical. This growing recognition has transformed relationships between archaeology, geology, and indigenous knowledge. Rather than viewing oral traditions as unreliable, many researchers now regard them as valuable sources of insight when interpreted thoughtfully and respectfully. The flood stories become part of a larger conversation about memory. How much can societies remember? How long can knowledge survive without writing? The answers remain uncertain. Yet examples from around the world suggest that human communities are capable of preserving important information far longer than once assumed. This possibility becomes especially intriguing when considering the enormous environmental transformations that follow the Ice Age. Imagine a coastline slowly retreating over generations. Imagine villages repeatedly relocating inland. Imagine children hearing stories about forests now submerged beneath shallow seas. Eventually, those children become elders. The stories continue. Over centuries, practical memories acquire symbolic meaning. The vanished forest becomes a sacred place. The flooded valley becomes a lost homeland. The advancing sea becomes an expression of supernatural power. The boundary between history and myth grows increasingly difficult to define. This does not mean the stories are false, nor does it mean they are precise records. They exist in a space between memory and meaning, a space where real experiences become cultural narratives. One of the most fascinating aspects of flood traditions is their tendency to focus on survival. Destruction is important, but survival is often more important. Again and again, stories describe individuals, families, or small groups who endure catastrophe while the surrounding world changes. They preserve knowledge. They rebuild communities. They carry life forward into a transformed future. This theme resonates because it reflects reality. Human history is filled with environmental challenges. Droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, storms, and climate shifts repeatedly disrupt societies. Yet people adapt. They migrate. They rebuild. Survival becomes one of humanity's defining characteristics. The flood stories celebrate that resilience. Even when framed through religious or mythological language, many narratives ultimately concern continuity rather than extinction. The world changes. Humanity continues. This pattern may help explain why flood stories prove so durable. They address universal concerns: loss, change, memory, survival. The themes remain relevant regardless of culture or historical period. Yet among all the possible sources of flood traditions, one hypothesis attracts extraordinary attention during the late 20th century. It proposes that a dramatic event in a single region may have left a particularly powerful mark on human memory. The setting is a body of water bordered by Europe, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Today it is known as the Black Sea. According to a controversial idea, this region may once have experienced a flood so dramatic that it inspired stories carried across generations and eventually preserved in ancient traditions. The hypothesis captures public imagination almost immediately. A vast basin, a rising sea, displaced populations, a catastrophe remembered for millennia. The story seems to contain everything people associate with legendary floods. Yet science is rarely so simple. As researchers begin examining the evidence, the mystery grows deeper. Some findings appear supportive. Others raise serious questions. What emerges is not a clear answer, but one of the most fascinating debates in the entire search for humanity's flood stories. The Black Sea appears calm today. Its dark waters stretch across a vast basin bordered by modern nations, shipping routes, fishing communities, and ancient landscapes. At first glance, there is little to suggest that this body of water occupies a central place in one of the most debated flood theories ever proposed. Yet beneath its surface lies an unusual history. Unlike most seas, the Black Sea contains layers of water that rarely mix. Deep below the surface, oxygen becomes scarce. In these dark depths, organic materials can survive for surprisingly long periods. Ancient shipwrecks, wooden structures, and other remnants sometimes remain preserved in conditions that would destroy them elsewhere. For archaeologists, this preservation is remarkable. For researchers studying ancient floods, it offers a unique opportunity. The story begins with a simple question. What was the Black Sea before it became the Black Sea? Geological evidence suggests that conditions in the region have changed dramatically over time. During periods of lower sea level associated with the Ice Age, the basin may have been partially isolated from the Mediterranean. Rivers flowing into it continued supplying fresh water. As a result, the water body occupying the basin may have looked very different from the sea visible today. The details are complex and remain the subject of ongoing investigation. What is generally accepted is that changing sea levels after the Ice Age altered the connections between the Black Sea and neighbouring waters. Exactly how this happened is where the debate begins. In the late 20th century, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed a dramatic hypothesis that captured worldwide attention. According to their interpretation, the Black Sea may once have existed as a large freshwater lake separated from the Mediterranean by a natural barrier. As global sea levels rose following the Ice Age, Mediterranean waters eventually reached that barrier. Then, according to the hypothesis, the barrier failed. The consequences would have been immense. Water from the Mediterranean would have surged into the lower Black Sea basin. Coastlines would have retreated. Large areas of previously inhabited land could have been submerged. Human populations living around the lake might have been displaced. The image was powerful, a flood of enormous scale, communities fleeing advancing waters, memories carried into future generations, potential connections to ancient flood traditions. The idea quickly attracted public fascination. Books were written. Documentaries explored the possibility. Popular discussions often portrayed the event as a likely source for some of humanity's most famous flood legends. Yet scientific debates rarely end so neatly. As researchers gathered additional evidence, questions emerged. Some geological findings appeared consistent with significant environmental change in the region. Others suggested a more gradual process than originally proposed. The central issue concerned timing and speed. Did Mediterranean waters enter the basin suddenly and catastrophically, or did the transformation occur more slowly? The distinction matters enormously. A rapid inundation could produce dramatic human consequences and memorable experiences. A slower change would still reshape the landscape, but might not generate the kind of catastrophe often imagined in popular accounts. Researchers examined sediment cores extracted from the seabed. They studied ancient shorelines. They analysed chemical signatures preserved within geological deposits. The results proved complicated. Some evidence supported substantial changes in water levels. Some studies suggested episodes of rapid environmental transition. Others indicated that the flooding may have unfolded less dramatically than the original hypothesis proposed. Scholars still debate important details today. No single explanation fully accounts for all available evidence. This uncertainty is not unusual in geology. Reconstructing events that occurred thousands of years ago requires interpreting incomplete records. New discoveries can alter previous conclusions. Scientific understanding evolves as evidence accumulates. The Black Sea debate illustrates this process perfectly. The region clearly experienced major environmental changes. The exact nature of those changes remains contested. Even if the most dramatic version of the flooding hypothesis ultimately proves incorrect, the broader significance of the region remains undeniable. Human populations lived around changing shorelines. Environmental transformations occurred. Water levels shifted. Landscapes familiar to prehistoric communities were altered. Those facts alone are important. The question is whether they were important enough to influence cultural memory on a large scale. Some researchers remain skeptical. Flood traditions exist in many regions far removed from the Black Sea. Similar narratives appear among cultures with no obvious connection to the basin. This diversity suggests that multiple sources likely contributed to humanity's flood stories. Others argue that regional events can still have broader influence. Human populations migrate, ideas spread, stories travel. A memorable disaster affecting one area may eventually influence traditions far beyond its original location. The evidence does not allow a definitive conclusion. What makes the Black Sea hypothesis so enduring is not that it has been proven beyond doubt. It is that it occupies a fascinating intersection between geology, archaeology, and mythology. For perhaps the first time, researchers seriously considered whether a specific environmental event might connect directly to some of humanity's oldest narratives. The discussion encouraged broader investigations into ancient flooding around the world. Scientists began paying closer attention to submerged landscapes. Archaeologists expanded efforts to explore underwater environments. Geologists refined methods for reconstructing ancient coastlines. Even where specific claims remained controversial, the overall effect was productive. The search for flood origins became more sophisticated. Instead of looking for a single universal catastrophe, researchers increasingly focused on regional histories. Different flood traditions might emerge from different experiences. Some could reflect river floods. Others could preserve memories of rising seas. Still others might originate in tsunamis or glacial lake outbursts. The flood stories no longer required one explanation. They could have many. This realization aligns more closely with the complexity of human history. Civilizations do not share identical experiences. Landscapes vary. Climates vary. Disasters vary. Yet people respond in surprisingly similar ways. They remember. They tell stories. They search for meaning. The Black Sea remains one chapter in that larger story. Whether it represents the source of specific traditions or merely one example among many, it highlights an important truth. The environments inhabited by ancient people were not static. They changed dramatically. Sometimes those changes unfolded slowly. Sometimes they occurred with startling speed, and every major change left traces. Some traces survive in sediments buried beneath the sea. Some survive in archaeological remains. Some survive in stories. The challenge is learning how to read them together. Fortunately, researchers are discovering new clues in places once thought inaccessible. Beneath modern waters, hidden landscapes are beginning to reveal themselves. Entire worlds lost to the sea are gradually emerging from darkness. For most of human history, the drowned landscapes remained invisible. People knew the sea covered them, but knowing and seeing are very different things. Beneath waves, currents, and layers of sediment, traces of ancient worlds rested beyond reach. Entire coastlines vanished from memory. Settlements disappeared. Rivers that once crossed broad plains flowed only in geological records hidden beneath the seabed. The oceans became archives. The problem was that no one could read them. Only in recent decades has technology begun to change that situation. Advances in sonar mapping, underwater archaeology, remotely operated vehicles, sediment analysis, and marine geology have allowed researchers to explore places that would have been inaccessible to earlier generations. The results have been extraordinary. Again and again, scientists discover evidence that confirms a simple but profound reality. Many of humanity's lost landscapes were real. Off modern coastlines, sonar surveys reveal the ghostly outlines of ancient river systems. Channels carved by flowing water appear beneath areas now covered by the sea. Some rivers are so clearly preserved that their courses can be mapped in remarkable detail. These rivers once carried fresh water through environments where people likely lived and travelled. Today they lie submerged beneath salt water. Elsewhere, researchers identify former shorelines resting far below present sea levels. Ancient beaches appear preserved beneath marine sediments. Sand deposits mark locations where waves once broke against land that no longer exists. The discoveries are reminders that coastlines are temporary. What seems permanent on a map may represent only a brief moment in a much longer story. One particularly striking category of evidence comes from drowned forests. In several parts of the world, storms occasionally expose ancient tree stumps buried beneath coastal waters or intertidal zones. Some remain rooted in the soil where they originally grew. Their presence reveals that areas now occupied by the sea were once dry land capable of supporting substantial vegetation. For local communities, these forests can appear almost supernatural. After powerful storms remove layers of sand, dark tree trunks emerge from beaches like visitors from another age. Yet there is nothing supernatural about them. They are witnesses to landscapes that existed before rising seas transformed the coastline. Radiocarbon dating often confirms great antiquity. Many of these forests lived thousands of years ago during periods when sea levels remained significantly lower than today. The trees could not survive the advancing ocean. The sea arrived. The forest died. The remains endured. Archaeology provides equally compelling discoveries. In various parts of the world, evidence of human activity has been recovered from submerged environments. Stone tools, fishing structures, ancient campsites, and other traces of occupation suggest that people once lived in places now hidden beneath water. The challenge is enormous. Underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive. Visibility can be poor. Sediments conceal evidence. Large areas remain unexplored. Even so, the growing body of discoveries continues expanding our understanding of prehistoric life. One important realization emerges repeatedly. Many early human communities preferred coastal environments. This preference makes sense. Coastlines offered abundant resources. Fish, shellfish, birds, marine mammals, and access to transportation routes made such regions attractive places to live. Rivers often met the sea there, creating rich ecological zones capable of supporting significant populations. The problem is that the very environments most attractive to prehistoric people are often the least likely to survive in the archaeological record. When sea levels rise, coastal settlements disappear first. As a result, modern researchers may be studying only part of the story. Entire chapters of human history could remain submerged. This possibility has profound implications. If many important settlements now lie underwater, then our picture of prehistory is necessarily incomplete. Some innovations, migrations, and cultural developments may have occurred in regions that later vanished beneath the sea. The flood narratives suddenly feel less abstract. Instead of imagining mythological worlds lost beneath water, researchers can point to real landscapes that suffered precisely that fate. Not every story reflects a specific drowned settlement. Not every legend preserves an exact historical memory. Yet the underlying experience becomes easier to understand. People truly did lose entire landscapes. The losses were not imaginary. One remarkable example comes from the North Sea, where decades of fishing activity have recovered artifacts from the submerged remains of Doggerland. Bones from Ice Age animals appear alongside evidence of human presence. Modern mapping has gradually revealed rivers, lakes, wetlands, and elevated ridges that once characterized the region. What emerges is not a barren plain, but a living world. People hunted there. People traveled there. People built their lives there. Now it rests beneath the sea. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Off the coasts of India, researchers investigate submerged structures and ancient shorelines. Around Australia, evidence of drowned landscapes continues to emerge. In Southeast Asia, reconstructions of Sunderland reveal the enormous scale of land lost to rising seas. Each discovery reinforces the same lesson. The Earth experienced dramatic transformations after the Ice Age. Human beings lived through them. Some memories may survive. The evidence does not support the idea that one enormous flood covered the entire globe simultaneously. Geological records simply do not show such an event during the period associated with human civilizations. Yet the evidence strongly supports something perhaps even more interesting. Many floods occurred, many coastlines disappeared, many communities adapted to environmental upheaval. Humanity's flood traditions may represent a mosaic assembled from countless experiences spread across thousands of years and multiple continents. This interpretation aligns more closely with both archaeology and geology. The world did not end once. Instead, different worlds ended repeatedly. A valley disappeared beneath the sea. A river destroyed a settlement. A tsunami erased a coastline. A glacial lake burst through its barriers. Each event contributed another thread to the larger tapestry of memory. The search for flood origins therefore becomes less about identifying a single catastrophe and more about understanding how humans respond to change. Disasters leave traces in sediments. They also leave traces in culture. Those cultural traces often survive long after the physical evidence becomes difficult to recognize. A story outlasts a village. A tradition outlasts a coastline. A memory can outlast a landscape. This may explain why flood narratives remain so persistent across human history. They are not merely stories about water. They are stories about loss. Stories about survival, stories about watching a familiar world disappear. And as researchers continue exploring drowned landscapes beneath modern seas, new clues keep emerging from the darkness. The deeper they look, the clearer it becomes that ancient floods were not isolated incidents. They were forces that helped shape the movement of people, the development of societies, and perhaps even the birth of civilization itself. The floodwaters do more than erase landscapes. They move people, and when people move, history changes. One of the most important consequences of environmental disruption is migration. A settlement destroyed by flooding must relocate. A shrinking coastline pushes communities inland. A disappearing source of food forces groups to explore unfamiliar territory. Sometimes these movements involve only a few families. Sometimes they involve entire populations. The archaeological record suggests that the period following the Ice Age is marked by remarkable mobility. Human groups expand into newly available lands left behind by retreating glaciers. Others abandon territories, becoming increasingly vulnerable to rising seas. Rivers create corridors of movement. Coastlines open and close. New opportunities emerge while old homelands vanish. The world is constantly rearranging itself. Migration is not always driven by disaster alone. People move in search of resources, trade security, and opportunity. Yet environmental pressure often acts as a powerful catalyst. Even modest changes can accumulate over generations until relocation becomes the most practical option. A coastline retreating a few miles may not sound dramatic. For a fishing community dependent on specific bays, estuaries, and river mouths, it can change everything. The relationship between flooding and migration is difficult to reconstruct, precisely because human decisions are complex. Rarely does one event produce one outcome. Multiple factors interact. Climate resources, social networks, technology, and cultural traditions all influence how communities respond. Still, what survives in the record suggests that environmental change frequently plays a significant role. The post-Ice Age world provides countless examples. As glaciers retreat across northern regions, people move into territories previously covered by ice. New hunting grounds become available. Rivers establish fresh routes through the landscape. Vegetation spreads into formerly barren areas. At the same time, rising seas gradually eliminate some of the most desirable coastal environments. Human populations are simultaneously gaining land in some places and losing it in others. This dynamic process creates opportunities for innovation. Communities encountering unfamiliar environments develop new strategies for survival. Different groups come into contact. Knowledge spreads. Technologies evolve. Environmental disruption, while often destructive, can also accelerate cultural change. The relationship is complicated. Floods destroy settlements. Floods also encourage adaptation. The same event can produce suffering and opportunity at the same time. This duality appears repeatedly throughout history. Ancient river civilizations provide a useful example. Floodplains are dangerous places to live. Seasonal inundations threaten homes and crops. Yet the fertile soils deposited by floods support agriculture on a scale impossible in many other environments. People remain because the rewards outweigh the risks. Over time, communities develop methods to manage water. They build canals. They construct levees. They organize labor. They create systems of cooperation capable of responding to environmental challenges. In many respects, civilization itself grows alongside rivers. The flood becomes both enemy and partner. This observation has led some historians to argue that water management plays a central role in the development of complex societies. While scholars continue debating the extent of that influence, few doubt that rivers and floods help shape the trajectories of numerous ancient civilizations. The connection between environmental change and social development extends beyond agriculture. Trade routes evolve as coastlines shift. Fishing practices adapt to changing marine environments. Settlement patterns respond to altered landscapes. Entire cultural traditions emerge from relationships with water. The legacy of flooding therefore extends far beyond individual disasters. It becomes woven into the structure of society itself. The story of the Nile illustrates this relationship particularly well. For thousands of years, annual flooding deposits fertile sediments across the floodplain. Egyptian civilization develops within a system deeply influenced by predictable seasonal waters. Unlike some rivers, the Nile often floods in relatively regular ways, creating conditions favorable for long-term agricultural planning. Yet even there, variations matter. Floods that are too small can produce shortages. Floods that are too large can cause destruction. Human prosperity remains linked to environmental conditions beyond complete control. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, and numerous other regions. Water is essential. Water is dangerous. Civilization emerges within the tension between those two realities. As populations grow and societies become more complex, memories of major floods acquire additional significance. They're no longer merely stories about survival. They become reflections on order and disorder, stability and chaos. A flood represents more than water crossing a boundary. It represents the collapse of expectations. Fields disappear, roads vanish, settlements become isolated. The familiar structure of life is disrupted. This symbolic dimension helps explain why flood narratives often occupy such prominent positions within cultural traditions. They express fundamental anxieties about fragility. Human beings build homes, cities, and institutions. Floods remind them that nature remains capable of overwhelming those achievements. The lesson is timeless. Archaeological evidence repeatedly demonstrates that societies must adapt to environmental conditions or face serious consequences. Some succeed, others struggle. Most experience both success and failure at different times. No civilization exists entirely apart from nature. The flood stories preserve that reality. Even when transformed into myths or religious narratives, they continue carrying messages about vulnerability and resilience. The persistence of those messages becomes particularly understandable when viewed against the backdrop of the post-Ice Age world. Generations witness changing coastlines. Generations witness shifting rivers. Generations witness environmental uncertainty. The experiences become embedded within culture. Over centuries, practical memory evolves into collective identity. A community may forget the exact location of a drowned shoreline. It may remember that the sea once stood elsewhere. A society may forget the precise details of an ancient flood. It may remember that water has the power to transform the world. Those memories endure because they remain relevant. The environmental changes of the distant past eventually stabilize. Sea levels approach something close to modern conditions. Coastlines become more familiar. The most dramatic phase of post-Ice Age flooding comes to an end. Yet the stories remain. And as writing spreads across civilizations, those stories gain a new form of permanence. They can now travel farther than memory alone ever allowed. They can cross centuries. They can cross continents. They can survive the collapse of the very societies that created them. The flood is becoming more than a local experience. It is becoming one of humanity's most enduring cultural ideas. As settlements grow into towns and towns grow into cities, humanity begins preserving its memories in a new way. For countless generations, stories survive only through spoken words. Elders teach the young. Families pass knowledge forward. Traditions travel from one generation to the next through repetition and remembrance. The system works remarkably well, but it has limits. Every story depends on people continuing to tell it. Writing changes everything. For the first time, memories can outlive memory itself. A story written onto claystone, papyrus, bamboo, parchment, or paper no longer depends entirely on living voices. It can survive wars, migrations, political upheavals, and the passing of centuries. It can travel far beyond the landscape where it originated. The flood stories are among the beneficiaries of this transformation. What may once have been local traditions become part of civilization's permanent record. As they spread, they continue evolving. The process is fascinating because written traditions rarely preserve stories exactly as they first existed. Instead, they reshape them. Religious beliefs influence interpretation. Political priorities affect emphasis. Moral lessons become intertwined with historical memory. The flood grows larger. The meaning grows deeper. In many traditions, the flood is no longer merely an environmental disaster. It becomes a cosmic event. The destruction of the old world acquires spiritual significance. The survivors become symbols. The waters represent judgment, purification, renewal, or transformation depending on the cultural context. This evolution is understandable. Human beings naturally seek meaning in catastrophe. A devastating flood is not simply a physical event. It raises questions about order, fate, morality, and humanity's place within the world. Stories help societies explore those questions. The flood narratives therefore operate on multiple levels simultaneously. They may preserve traces of real experiences. They may communicate ethical lessons. They may reinforce cultural identity. They may explain aspects of the natural world. These functions are not mutually exclusive. A story can be historically inspired while also serving symbolic purposes. Modern debates sometimes create a false choice between history and myth, as though a narrative must belong entirely to one category or the other. Ancient traditions often occupy a more complicated middle ground. The memory of a real flood may become a sacred story. A sacred story may preserve genuine environmental observations. Both can be true at once. This complexity becomes increasingly visible as flood narratives spread across different civilizations. In some traditions, survival depends upon preparation. In others, survival depends upon wisdom. Elsewhere, survival depends upon divine favor, community cooperation, or perseverance. The variations reveal cultural priorities. Different societies emphasize different lessons. Yet beneath those differences remains a common structure. The world changes. Most people are unprepared. A few survive. Life continues. The persistence of this pattern suggests that flood narratives speak to universal human concerns. Environmental disasters expose vulnerability. They remind societies that stability is never guaranteed. This message remains relevant regardless of era. Even today, modern communities experience floods capable of transforming lives within hours. Advanced technology has reduced some risks, but has not eliminated them. Rivers still overflow. Storm surges still strike coastlines. Tsunamis still arrive without warning. The ancient stories continue resonating because the underlying experiences have never completely disappeared. At the same time, writing allows flood traditions to influence one another in ways oral traditions rarely could. Ideas travel along trade routes. Texts are copied and translated. Stories cross cultural boundaries. A narrative originating in one region may inspire adaptations in another. This process complicates efforts to identify original sources. By the time many flood stories enter the historical record, they have already experienced centuries of development. The earliest versions are often lost. Researchers therefore face a challenging task. They must distinguish between the age of a written text and the age of the traditions contained within it. A flood narrative recorded 3,000 years ago may preserve ideas far older than the manuscript itself. How much older remains uncertain. The evidence rarely provides definitive answers. Nevertheless, the possibility of deep historical roots continues attracting scholarly interest. Some flood traditions may preserve memories stretching back toward the end of the Ice Age. Others may reflect more recent events. Many likely contain layers accumulated across different periods. The stories become cultural mosaics. Pieces from multiple generations combine into a single narrative. This process mirrors the geological history of flooding itself. The Earth does not experience one flood. It experiences countless floods. Likewise, human memory does not preserve one simple story. It preserves countless memories blended together over time. The result is a remarkable archive of environmental experience, not an archive in the modern scientific sense, an archive of meaning, an archive of survival, an archive of humanity's long relationship with water. This relationship extends far beyond catastrophe. Floods destroy, but they also create. River sediments enrich soils. Wetlands support biodiversity. Seasonal inundations sustain agriculture. Many of the world's most productive environments depend upon periodic flooding. Ancient societies understood this duality well. They feared water. They depended upon water. Their stories reflect both emotions simultaneously. The flood is rarely portrayed as purely evil. More often it represents a force beyond human control, a force capable of both destruction and renewal. This balance may explain why flood narratives remain among the most enduring stories ever told. They capture something fundamental about the human condition. People build, nature changes, people adapt. The cycle continues. As archaeologists, geologists, and historians compare evidence from around the world, a broader picture begins emerging. The flood traditions are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a larger historical pattern, linking environmental change, cultural memory, migration, and survival. The story is becoming clearer, not simpler, but clearer. Humanity's flood narratives likely arise from many different events across many different places. Yet all those events share common themes. Water reshapes landscapes. Landscapes reshape societies. Societies reshape memories. And memories reshape history. The challenge now is determining how much of this vast inheritance can be traced back to real environmental transformations, and how much emerged through the creative power of culture itself. The answer lies somewhere between certainty and mystery. The closer researchers look at the evidence, the more they encounter an uncomfortable reality. There is no single flood. For centuries, many people hoped that one great catastrophe might explain the remarkable spread of flood traditions across the world. The idea was appealing in its simplicity. One enormous disaster occurs. Survivors carry the memory forward. Over time, the story spreads into different cultures. It is a powerful narrative. The problem is that the evidence rarely behaves so neatly. Geology reveals floods occurring in different regions at different times. Archaeology uncovers communities responding to local environmental crises, separated by thousands of miles and often thousands of years. Oral traditions preserve memories shaped by unique cultural experiences. Written records reflect centuries of adaptation and reinterpretation. The closer the investigation comes to the details, the more complexity emerges. Yet complexity does not weaken the mystery. In many ways, it makes the mystery more fascinating. The search gradually shifts from a question of whether a single flood happened to a deeper question about how human beings remember environmental change. This distinction matters. A single worldwide flood would be primarily a geological question. Human memory is a cultural question, and cultural questions are often more difficult to answer. Consider the remarkable diversity of flood experiences preserved throughout history. A farming community beside a river may remember seasonal floods that suddenly become unusually destructive. A coastal population may witness rising seas slowly consuming ancestral territory. Island societies may survive tsunamis generated by distant earthquakes. Communities near glaciers may encounter catastrophic outburst floods released from unstable lakes. Each experience is different, yet each can generate stories containing surprisingly similar themes. Water arrives, the familiar world disappears, survivors endure, life begins again. The recurrence of these themes suggests something important about the human mind. People naturally organize catastrophe into narrative. Stories help transform chaos into understanding. They provide explanations where uncertainty exists. They preserve lessons that might otherwise be forgotten. Most importantly, they connect present generations to past experiences. In this sense, flood stories function almost like cultural memory systems. Not perfect memory systems, not historical records in the modern sense, but systems capable of carrying essential information across long spans of time. Modern research into memory offers intriguing parallels. Psychologists have long observed that emotionally powerful events tend to be remembered more vividly than ordinary experiences. Communities often preserve memories of disasters because those events alter lives in significant ways. The details may change. The emotional core frequently remains. A flood destroying a settlement is exactly the kind of event likely to leave lasting impressions, especially when the consequences extend beyond a single generation. Imagine a coastal community gradually abandoning territory lost to the sea. Parents tell children about places that no longer exist. Those children repeat the stories to their own descendants. Over centuries, memory evolves but does not necessarily disappear. The original geography may become difficult to recognize. The sense of loss remains. This possibility has encouraged scholars to reconsider how ancient traditions are interpreted. Earlier generations of researchers often placed myths and history into entirely separate categories. Myths were treated as fiction. History was treated as fact. Reality appears more complicated. Many traditions contain layers. Some elements are symbolic. Some elements may preserve genuine observations. Separating one from the other is rarely straightforward. A flood narrative can simultaneously communicate spiritual beliefs and preserve memories of environmental change. The presence of symbolism does not automatically erase historical value, nor does the presence of historical inspiration transform a story into literal fact. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue debating where particular traditions fall along this spectrum. The debate itself reveals something important. Flood stories matter because they occupy a boundary between the known and the unknown. They connect measurable geological processes with human experience. The geology is often easier to reconstruct. Scientists can examine sediments. They can map ancient shorelines. They can date flood deposits. They can identify evidence of tsunamis and sea level change. The human experience is more elusive. Fear leaves few fossils. Memory rarely survives in stone. Emotion does not preserve itself in sediments. To understand those dimensions, researchers must turn to archaeology, anthropology, oral traditions, and cultural history. Only then does a fuller picture emerge. The picture suggests that humanity spent thousands of years living through profound environmental transformation. The end of the Ice Age was not merely a climatic event. It was a human event. Coastlines moved, rivers changed, habitats shifted, migration patterns evolved, entire landscapes disappeared. People adapted repeatedly. The flood traditions may be one of the surviving cultural expressions of that adaptation, not because every story records the same event, but because many societies experienced variations of the same challenge, the challenge of living in a changing world. This interpretation also helps explain why flood narratives remain meaningful long after the original events have faded. The stories are not only about ancient waters, they are about uncertainty, they are about resilience, they are about confronting forces larger than any individual community can control. These themes never become obsolete. Every generation faces its own forms of environmental uncertainty. Every generation must adapt. The ancient stories continue speaking because the underlying human experience remains familiar. Meanwhile, science continues uncovering new evidence. Submerged landscapes are mapped with increasing precision. Underwater archaeology expands. Climate reconstructions become more detailed. Researchers gain better tools for understanding the ancient world. Each discovery adds clarity. None removes the mystery entirely. The flood stories endure precisely because they resist simple explanations. They are geological and cultural, historical and symbolic, local and universal, rooted in specific places yet capable of transcending them. The search for a single answer gradually gives way to a richer understanding. Humanity did not inherit one flood memory. Humanity inherited many. Together, those memories form one of the oldest and most persistent traditions ever carried across generations, and their influence extends far beyond the ancient world. The waters may have receded long ago, but the legacy they left behind continues shaping how people understand history, nature, and themselves. The ancient flood stories survive because the world keeps reminding humanity why they mattered. Long after the great post-Ice Age sea level rise slows, and coastlines approach their modern positions, floods continue shaping history. Rivers still overflow, storms still devastate coastlines, tsunamis still arrive with terrifying speed. Entire communities still discover that landscapes they considered permanent are anything but permanent. The lessons carried through thousands of years never become irrelevant. In many ways, the flood narratives represent humanity's oldest warning. Civilizations often imagine themselves secure. Cities rise behind walls, fields stretch across fertile plains, trade routes connect distant regions. Technology advances, prosperity grows, then nature intervenes. A river changes course. A drought weakens a society. A volcanic eruption darkens the sky. A flood arrives. The assumption of permanence suddenly disappears. Archaeology repeatedly demonstrates how fragile even successful civilizations can be. Ancient societies that once seemed powerful sometimes decline rapidly when environmental pressures combine with political instability, conflict disease, or economic disruption. Rarely does one factor act alone. History is more complicated than that. Yet environmental change often plays a significant role. The flood stories preserve awareness of this reality. At their core, many of them concern the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. They remind listeners that no settlement, however prosperous, exists entirely apart from its environment. This perspective becomes increasingly relevant as modern science reconstructs the history of climate and environmental change. The Earth revealed by geology is not static. It is dynamic. Coastlines migrate, deserts expand and contract, forests advance and retreat, ice sheets grow and disappear, sea levels rise and fall. The planet has always changed. Human civilization developed during a relatively stable period compared to some earlier chapters of Earth's history. This stability allowed agriculture cities, trade networks, and states to flourish. Yet even within that stability, environmental hazards never vanished. The ancient stories endure because they acknowledge a truth that remains valid. Nature is not obligated to preserve the world exactly as people prefer it. The drowned landscapes hidden beneath modern seas provide powerful evidence of this principle. Doggerland once existed, now it does not. Large portions of Sunderland once existed, now they do not. Ancient coastlines around the world supported communities whose homes now lie beneath water. The losses were real. The transformation was permanent. What survives are fragments. Fragments of landscape, fragments of archaeology, fragments of memory. When viewed together, those fragments reveal something remarkable. Human beings experienced environmental change on a scale capable of reshaping entire regions. Yet they survived. Again and again, survival emerges as the defining theme. Communities relocate. Cultures adapt. Knowledge evolves. New societies emerge from changing conditions. The flood narratives often focus on destruction, but they rarely end there. They continue beyond catastrophe. The survivors rebuild. The world continues. Life persists. This emphasis reflects one of the most consistent patterns in human history. People are extraordinarily resilient. The archaeological record is filled with examples. Populations recover from volcanic eruptions, droughts, floods, epidemics, and migrations. Sometimes recovery takes generations. Sometimes cultures transform so completely that they become difficult to recognize. Even then, continuity often survives beneath the surface. Traditions endure. Languages preserve traces of earlier worlds. Stories carry memory across time. The flood narratives belong to this broader process of cultural survival. They function as bridges between vanished landscapes and living societies. The people who first experienced the events inspiring these stories are long gone. Their settlements may have disappeared. Their names may be forgotten. Yet echoes remain. A story told around a fire. A legend recorded by a scribe. A tradition passed between generations. Through such pathways, fragments of ancient experience continue reaching the present. This realization changes how the flood stories are understood. The most important question may not be whether a specific narrative is literally true in every detail. The more important question may be why it survived. Countless stories disappear from history. These stories endured. They endured because they addressed concerns fundamental to human existence. Change, loss, memory, survival. Every society encounters these realities. Every society develops ways to understand them. Flood narratives became one of humanity's most successful methods. The stories also reveal something about the scale of time. Modern people often think in years, decades, or perhaps centuries. Geological processes operate across millennia. Flood traditions occupy an unusual middle ground. They connect human memory to environmental timescales. A drowned coastline becomes part of cultural history. A changing landscape becomes ancestral memory. A geological process becomes a story. Few traditions accomplish this so effectively. This is one reason researchers remain fascinated by flood narratives despite centuries of study. The stories are not merely relics of the past. They are records of interaction between people and the planet itself. The interaction remains ongoing. Modern coastal cities now occupy regions that ancient communities would immediately recognize as vulnerable. Millions of people live on floodplains. Major economic centers depend upon stable coastlines and predictable water systems. Technology provides protection. It does not eliminate risk. The ancient stories continue offering perspective, not because they predict the future, not because they contain hidden scientific knowledge, but because they remind humanity that environmental change has always been part of the human experience. The people who lived through rising seas after the Ice Age could not stop the oceans. The communities facing river floods in Mesopotamia could not control every aspect of the rivers. What they could do was adapt. That lesson remains relevant. The flood stories therefore occupy a unique place in history. They're among the oldest surviving reminders that civilizations exist within nature, not outside it. Their endurance is itself evidence of their importance. Generation after generation found value in preserving them. Generation after generation continued listening. And as the search for their origins approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. What does the entire story reveal about humanity's relationship with the lost worlds hidden beneath the sea? The answer lies not only in the floods themselves, but in the memories they left behind. In the end, the greatest mystery is not the flood. The greatest mystery is memory. The waters that reshaped coastlines, drowned valleys, erased forests, and displaced communities have long since settled into the landscapes familiar today. The glaciers that once covered continents are mostly gone. The ancient shorelines now lie hidden beneath oceans. The people who witnessed those transformations vanished thousands of years ago, yet somehow traces of their experiences remain, not in monuments, not in empires, not in written records carved at the moment the events occurred. They remain in stories. This survival is extraordinary when viewed against the scale of time involved. Civilizations rise and disappear. Languages evolve beyond recognition. Kingdoms collapse. Entire cultures fade from the historical record. Even great cities eventually become ruins. Stories often outlast them all. The flood traditions that continue circulating around the world today represent one of humanity's longest-running conversations with its own past. They are imperfect. They are layered with symbolism. They've been reshaped by countless generations, yet their persistence demands attention. Something important allowed them to endure. Modern science has transformed the way these stories are understood. For centuries, many discussions focused on whether ancient flood narratives should be interpreted literally. The debate often became trapped between extremes. Either the stories described a single worldwide catastrophe, or they were dismissed as pure invention. The evidence suggests a more interesting reality. The world experienced enormous environmental changes after the end of the Ice Age. Sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines retreated. Lowlands disappeared. Glacial lakes burst. Rivers flooded. Tsunamis struck vulnerable shores. Human populations experienced these events in countless different ways. The flood traditions appear to preserve echoes of that reality, not as direct historical reports, not as geological textbooks, but as cultural memories shaped by human experience. This interpretation explains why flood stories are simultaneously similar and different. The similarities emerge because people across the world confront comparable challenges. Water threatens settlements, landscapes change, survivors rebuild, communities seek meaning in catastrophe. The differences emerge because every region possesses its own geography, climate, traditions, and history. Each culture remembers in its own way. Together, those memories form something larger than any individual narrative. They form a collective reflection on humanity's relationship with change. This relationship lies at the heart of the entire story. The flood is ultimately not about water alone. It is about impermanence. People naturally assume the world around them will remain familiar. A coastline appears permanent. A river seems predictable. A homeland feels eternal. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. The people living in Doggerland likely never imagined that fishing vessels would someday pass above their former settlements. The inhabitants of drowned coastal plains did not know their landscapes would disappear beneath the sea. The communities preserving stories of vanished lands could not foresee how long those stories would survive. Yet all of these things happened. The world changed. The memory remained. There is something profoundly human in that pattern. Human beings possess limited power over geological forces. They cannot stop glaciers from melting. They cannot prevent seas from rising over thousands of years. They cannot control every flood storm or earthquake. What they can do is remember. Memory becomes a form of resistance against disappearance. A drowned landscape may vanish physically. It can continue existing culturally. An ancestral homeland may be lost beneath water. Its story can remain alive. This ability to preserve meaning even when places disappear may be one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. The flood narratives demonstrate it beautifully. Whether emerging from rising seas in prehistoric Europe, changing coastlines in Australia, Powerful rivers in Mesopotamia, catastrophic tsunamis, or countless other experiences, the stories accomplish the same essential task. They carry the past forward, not perfectly, not unchanged, but successfully. Modern archaeology and geology continue uncovering evidence from the lost worlds beneath the water. New technologies reveal ancient river systems. Submerged forests emerge from sediments. Drowned settlements become visible through sonar surveys and underwater exploration. Each discovery adds detail to the picture. Yet even as scientific knowledge grows, uncertainty remains. Scholars still debate the Black Sea hypothesis. They still debate the age of particular traditions. They still debate how accurately oral memory can preserve environmental events across millennia. The evidence remains incomplete. Perhaps it always will. Some questions belong partly to history and partly to mystery. The flood traditions occupy that space. Enough evidence exists to connect them with real environmental experiences. Not enough evidence exists to reduce them to simple explanations. The result is a story that remains endlessly fascinating. A story stretching from the end of the Ice Age to the modern world. A story crossing continents, cultures, languages, and thousands of years. A story hidden beneath waves and preserved in memory. When viewed from the highest perspective, the flood that changed human history may not have been a single event at all. It may have been a vast sequence of transformations experienced by countless communities across generations. A river flood here, a drowned coastline there, a vanished plain beyond the horizon. Together they shaped migration memory, tradition, and identity. Together they became one of humanity's oldest narratives. The waters rose, the landscapes changed, the people adapted, and the stories survived. The flood stories begin with water, but they end with something quieter. They end with memory drifting across time. Far beneath modern seas, ancient river valleys remain where they were carved thousands of years ago. Forests that once echoed with birdsong rest beneath layers of sand and salt water. Coastlines that supported generations of families survive only as faint contours on underwater maps. Entire worlds exist beyond ordinary sight, hidden beneath waves that move calmly above them. The people who lived in those places are gone. Their homes are gone. Their footprints vanished long ago. Yet the landscapes are not completely lost. Fragments remain in sediments. Fragments remain in archaeology. Fragments remain in stories carried farther than anyone who first told them could have imagined. Across thousands of years, human beings continue doing what they have always done. They watch the world change. They try to understand it. They pass their experiences to those who come after them. Sometimes the message survives. A tale of rising waters, a memory of a vanished shore, a warning preserved in tradition, a reminder that the boundaries between land and sea stability and change, certainty and uncertainty, are never as permanent as they appear. The flood narratives endure because they speak to something larger than any single disaster. They speak to the fragile nature of the worlds people build around themselves. They speak to loss, adaptation, and continuity. They speak to the quiet resilience that allows communities to survive even when familiar landscapes disappear. Perhaps that is why the stories continue to feel relevant. Not because they reveal a hidden secret, not because they solve every mystery, but because they remind us that change has always been part of the human experience. Long before cities rose, long before writing preserved history, people stood beside rivers, lakes, and coastlines, watching the world transform around them. They could not know how far their memories would travel, yet somehow those memories endured. And now across the immense distance of time, the waters have become still. The drowned forests remain silent beneath the sea. Ancient river channels sleep beneath layers of sediment. Lost coastlines rest in darkness. Above them, the modern world continues its journey, often unaware of the vanished landscapes below. But the stories remain, like distant echoes carried across thousands of years, quiet reminders of forgotten shores. Quiet reminders of survival, Quiet reminders that even when worlds disappear, memory can sometimes endure.